Hello everybody and welcome to week 8 of Bio 6601, Environmental and Biological Ethics. Today's topic brings together environmental ethics, political conflict, and ecological systems in a way that's deeply relevant, not just for scientists, but for anyone who uses water, food, land, or energy. So essentially, everyone. This week we're focusing on resource rights, the question of who has the right to use shared natural resources, and the idea known as tragedy of the commons. These concepts are key to understanding real-world conflict, especially when it comes to limited resources like clean air, forests, grazing land, and, as we'll explore in depth, freshwater. We'll spend most of today examining a detailed case study, the ongoing water dispute in the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River Basin, or the ACF Basin. But before we get into the geography and legal battles, we need to understand the philosophical and ecological framework behind this conflict. One of the core patterns that we see in resource management across time periods, cultures, and ecosystems is this. When natural resources are made available to many users, especially without clear regulation, they tend to be overused. We've seen this with forests cleared for timber, fisheries collapsed from overharvesting, groundwater pumped dry, and now even the atmosphere overwhelmed with carbon emissions. The issue is that individualized users are often incentivized to act in their own short-term interests, to extract as much as they can before someone else does. But the cost of overuse, ecological damage, scarcity, pollution, that cost is shared by everyone. So over time, these costs catch up. Resources can become limited or degraded, and in extreme cases, entire systems can collapse. This kind of dynamic is what we refer to as a tragedy of the commons. And it's not just a concept, it's playing out right now in river basins, in rangelands, in fisheries, and even in global climate systems. The term tragedy of the commons wasn't coined until the 20th century, but the idea goes back much further. In 1833, William Forster Lloyd, who was a British economist, published a series of lectures discussing population growth and resource scarcity. Lloyd used the example of grazing lands to illustrate what happens when resources are privately owned versus held in common. Here's how it works. If a pasture is privately owned, the landowner has an incentive to manage it sustainably. Overgrazing would damage the land and reduce the long-term value of both the pasture and the livestock. The owner experiences both the costs and the benefits of that resource use. But if the same pasture is held in common, or it is open to everyone in the village, then each herder has an incentive to add more animals to maximize their individual benefit. After all, the cost of overgrazing is spread across all users, but the benefit goes directly to the one that's adding more livestock. So this imbalance leads to overuse and eventually leads to resource collapse. Lloyd didn't call it a tragedy at this point, but the dynamics he described have become the foundation of one of the most important ideas in environmental ethics. So if we fast forward to 1968, Garrett Hardin was an American ecologist, and he published his now famous paper, The Tragedy of the Commons, in the journal Science. Hardin took Lloyd's concept and reframed it in a modern environmental context. His core argument was this: when a resource is collectively owned or accessible to many, but the consequences of overuse are shared, it inevitably leads to its degradation. Think about it like this. If 100 people can fish in the same lake, and each wants to catch as much as possible before the fish are gone, the lake gets overfished. Even though each person may say, well, if I don't take them, someone else will. That logic, repeated 100 times over for the 100 people that are fishing, is what leads to collapse. Hardin emphasized the need for regulation, mutual agreement, or privatization, otherwise shared resources would continue to be exploited to the point of destruction. He did not mince words either. One of his most quoted lines is, "The human species, viewed as a whole, has been a disaster for the earth." This might sound extreme, but it's a wake-up call that still resonates today. So what exactly do we mean by the commons when we're referring to the tragedy of the commons? In environmental terms, the commons are natural resources that are shared among many users, but not exclusively owned by anyone. These include forests, especially public lands that are logged or cleared for agriculture, the atmosphere, where carbon emissions and air pollutants accumulate, water, such as rivers, lakes, groundwater, or aquifers, grazing lands, so these could be fisheries, and grazing lands for agriculture, and that also land refers to the biodiversity that that land holds. These resources are very vital to everyone's survival. They are difficult to divide or privatize, and they're highly vulnerable to overuse if they're not well managed. As we'll see, the management or the mismanagement of the commons is one of the biggest ethical and policy challenges facing modern society. So one of the most complex commons that we manage in the United States is water, especially in interstate river systems. So let's explore what happens when upstream and downstream states fight over who gets how much. This brings us to a real-world case study, the ACF water wars. The water wars are a decades-long legal and political battle over water rights between Georgia and Alabama and the state of Florida, so the tri-state area. This picture here on the left is an example of a river system from Vietnam where water, as you can see here, is very, very vital to the lands, to the communities that live off of those land, and the culture associated with those communities. And we all know what happens when water resources are overexploited or not taken care of accordingly. But why else are we talking about water? We know that water is essential to life, it's not easily substitutable, and it's vulnerable to both overuse and pollution. In the southeastern U.S., the ACF, or again the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint Basin, serves multiple critical needs. It serves as a municipal supply, farming, hydropower, navigation, wildlife, fisheries, etc. And when you have multiple states, thousands of stakeholders, and limited rainfall during drought years, it's no surprise that conflict erupts. The legal fights have gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times, and still there's no binding agreement on how to share that water. This is not just a political issue, though, not just in the Southeast, but worldwide. This issue keeps emerging. It's both an ethical and ecological one. Who gets water when there's not enough? Do cities? Do farmers? Do fish? Do ecosystems? We're going to start unpacking that right now. And to begin with that, we're going to start with how did we get here? We need an understanding of the geography and the ecology behind the ACF basin. So let's begin by zooming out and examining the watershed itself. The ACF basin is one of the most important and contested watersheds in the southeastern U.S. It spans portions of 3 states, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and it covers nearly 20,000 square miles. Ecologically, the ACF is extraordinary. It supports 148 species of fish, 49 mussel species, and 17 endemic species, meaning that they're just found in the ACF basin, nowhere else. Of these species, 7 are federally threatened and 16 are state listed as vulnerable. Geographically, the basin cuts across 3 physiographic provinces: the Blue Ridge Mountains in the north, the Piedmont, where Atlanta is located, and the coastal plain, which leads down into the Gulf of Mexico. The watershed also overlays 5 major aquifers, which makes its groundwater and surface water interactions very complex and extremely sensitive to pumping and rainfall patterns. In short, this is a rich but fragile ecosystem, and the stakes for managing it properly are sky high. So let's take a closer look at how each of the 3 rivers, the Chattahoochee, the Flint, and the Apalachicola, contribute to the system and shapes the conflict. Here you can see the ACF in a broader regional context, which has similar water resource issues to a nearby basin spanning multiple states, which is the ACT, or the Alabama-Coosa-Tallapoosa Basin. So here you can see where we're discussing the ACF. You have the Apalachicola, the Chattahoochee, and the Flint. And then adjacent to that, you have the Alabama, Coosa, and Tallapoosa river drainages, where you can see that that spans several states as well, and you'll see similar water issues and disputes occurring in the ACT as what we're going to discuss here today in the ACF. So focusing just on the ACF, we're going to begin our deep dive starting with the Chattahoochee River, which starts in Georgia's mountains and flows through one of the most water-hungry metro areas in our country. So the Chattahoochee is one of the most politically contentious stretches of the ACF. It originates in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the northeast of Georgia, near Brasstown Bald, which is Georgia's highest point, and it flows southwest, eventually forming the border between Georgia and Alabama. As it courses downstream, the Chattahoochee plays a vital role in supplying metro Atlanta's water supply. In fact, 70% of Atlanta's water supply comes from the Chattahoochee, making it one of the most heavily relied upon rivers for municipal water in the southeastern United States. Now, you might think that would mean it's a mighty river, but at its headwaters, it's actually quite small, and that's the core of the problem. Atlanta is a city of over 5 million people. It sits near the headwaters of a relatively modest river. This placement creates a severe mismatch between population demand and natural hydrology. Downstream, the river passes through cities like Columbus, Georgia, and Eufaula, Alabama, where it also supports hydropower generation, recreation, and ecological services. This means that every drop of water retained upstream, especially during droughts, becomes a legal and ethical flashpoint. And if you're wondering just how upstream decisions play out politically, consider this. Georgia controls 82% of the ACF watershed, but Alabama and Florida bear the consequences of its decisions. This is the core of what we're going to be talking about today. This has led to years of litigation, federal intervention, and even threats of congressional action. So now that we've traced the Chattahoochee, starting in northern Georgia, coming down through Georgia and Alabama, let's look at the sister river to the east, which is the Flint River. While not as politically loud as the Chattahoochee, and it doesn't have a song named after it, the Flint is absolutely essential to understanding water use and water conflict in the basin. The Flint begins near the Atlanta metropolitan area as well, but specifically it's in the southern suburbs near the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. So while the Chattahoochee starts in northern Georgia above Atlanta, the Flint starts slightly below it, but the Flint runs adjacent to the Chattahoochee in this area. But the airport near where it starts is one of the busiest airports in the world. Unlike the Chattahoochee River, which is dammed and managed extensively, the Flint is one of the largest major undammed rivers in the entire country for a big chunk of its length, which is pretty fascinating in this day and age. It flows more than 300 miles south through primarily rural Georgia, winding through agricultural regions before merging with the Chattahoochee near the Florida border. The Flint is notable for maintaining much of its natural flow regime, which makes it ecologically rich, but also extremely vulnerable during times of drought. A key thing to understand is that the Flint River Basin is intensively agricultural. Farmers in southwest Georgia rely heavily on irrigation, often drawing water directly from the Flint or its connected aquifers. During drought conditions, agricultural water withdrawals from this river spike, just as urban withdrawals from the Chattahoochee increase. This means that during low flow periods, both rivers, the Chattahoochee and the Flint, are being hit hard at the same time for different reasons. The environmental impacts of this are significant. Lower flows in the Flint reduce aquatic habitat, stress endangered mussel species, and limit flow into the Apalachicola downstream. To make matters worse, the irrigation withdrawals are largely unregulated in Georgia, which creates challenges in enforcing conservation or water limits. Farmers, understandably, are trying to maintain crop yields, which is also critically important, but the cumulative impact of droughts and increased water withdrawals to augment those droughts are cumulative. That impact is detrimental to the health of the river and its downstream ecosystems. So when the Chattahoochee and the Flint finally come together at the Georgia-Florida line, they form the Apalachicola River. So this is where the ecological and the economic stakes are arguably the highest. So the Apalachicola begins where the Chattahoochee and the Flint rivers converge at Lake Seminole. This is right on the border of Georgia and Florida, and from there it flows through the Florida Panhandle, winding through one of the most biodiverse floodplain ecosystems in North America before emptying into the Apalachicola Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. This river is short compared to the others. It's only about 106 miles long, but its impact is enormous. The Apalachicola is home to vast floodplain forests, federally protected fish and mussel species, and one of the country's most productive oyster fisheries. Historically, 90% of Florida's oysters came from the Apalachicola Bay, but this fishery depends on a precise mixture of freshwater and saltwater. When upstream states draw too much water, or when droughts hit, freshwater flow drops and saltwater intrudes into the bay. This shifts the salinity balance, causing massive oyster die-offs, disrupting commercial fishing, and crippling local economies. In fact, following years of poor flow and ecosystem collapse, Florida shut down all wild oyster harvesting in the Apalachicola Bay in 2020. The fishery is closed until at least 2025, this year, and it's uncertain whether the ecosystem can fully recover or is fully recovering. This is an incredibly stark example of how decisions hundreds of miles upstream directly impacts livelihoods and biodiversity downstream. Something that might surprise you is that the Apalachicola supports extensive wetland forests, cypress swamps, and over 1,300 species of plants and animals. It is a national treasure and one that depends entirely on flow decisions made by other states. So now that we've traced all three rivers of the ACF Basin, the Chattahoochee, the Flint, and down into the Apalachicola, we can better understand the tangled web of stakeholders, ecosystems, and competing demands. So let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture of water use across the entire basin, specifically how the water in the system is actually used and by whom. So water in the ACF Basin is incredibly diverse and multifaceted. This is part of why this issue is so complicated. We're not talking about one single use or one dominant interest. Instead, this water is simultaneously expected to support municipal water supply, especially for Metro Atlanta, hydropower generation at several dams, agricultural irrigation, especially in the Flint River Basin, flood control to protect infrastructure and downstream communities, navigation, especially for historic routes, wildlife support, including endangered species and wetland habitats, and recreation, from boating and fishing to tourism and shoreline development. Each of these uses involves different stakeholders, different laws, and different ideas of what water needs are. And that's just the beginning. Here's where the real tension lies. Georgia, particularly Atlanta and its surrounding counties, has the largest portion of the watershed, as we mentioned, 82%. But water does not stop at state lines. Natural resources do not respect political boundaries. This water from Georgia continues downstream into Alabama and Florida, where communities, ecosystems, and economies rely on that flow. So even though Georgia is upstream and holds the lion's share of the basin, its decisions profoundly affect its neighbors, which is why the political battles over water allocation have been so fierce. This set the stage for our next focus, the role of Atlanta, the dominant urban force in this entire equation. To truly understand why water is such a flashpoint in the ACF, we're going to talk about Atlanta in the physical location of it, in the watershed, and also the political clout that it holds. So Metro Atlanta is the economic and political powerhouse of Georgia. It's home to over 5 million residents, spanning across more than 8,000 square miles, and covers multiple counties. It has enormous social, economic, and political influence, both within the state and nationally. But here's a key issue. Atlanta is located at the headwaters, or the top, of the ACF system. The Chattahoochee River, which supplies most of the city's drinking water, is relatively small at this point in its flow. And yet, this modest river is being tapped to meet the needs of one of the largest urban populations in the southeastern United States. So what's the problem? If you were designing a major city from scratch and trying to site it for maximum water security, this would probably be one of the worst locations that you could choose. The water supply is limited, inconsistent during drought years, and is subject to upstream-downstream conflict. Despite this, Atlanta's growth has been staggering, and so have its water needs. The city has come to depend heavily on Lake Lanier, which is a reservoir on the Chattahoochee that was never originally intended as a municipal water source. So as a result, decisions made by Atlanta-based agencies and water utilities have significant ripple effects downstream. And given the city's political leverage, this has led to feelings of imbalance and frustration for Alabama and Florida, who often argue that their needs are being deprioritized. This becomes even more ethically complex when we consider that much of the water used in Atlanta is returned to the river as treated wastewater, but the timing and quality of that return does not necessarily meet the needs of downstream ecosystems or communities. And speaking of those downstream communities, let's now turn to what's at stake in Alabama and Florida and why this conflict isn't just about water, it's about livelihoods, ecosystems, and equity. So specifically looking at what's at stake downstream in southern Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, as we've already discussed, water does not respect state borders. So when Georgia, and Atlanta in particular, increases its water withdrawals, the available flow to Alabama and Florida is reduced, especially during dry periods. So let's look at what this means for each downstream region. In southern Georgia, below Atlanta, even within Georgia itself, there are downstream interests. So in the Flint River Basin, farmers rely on water for agricultural irrigation, especially for crops like peanuts, cotton, and corn. These areas also depend on the river for hydroelectricity, recreation, and municipal supply. So when water is diverted or retained in metro Atlanta, rural Georgians are affected too. This is a tension that has created intra-state political pressure. Then we have Alabama. So as the Chattahoochee flows south, it forms a state boundary between Georgia and Alabama, and it supports hydroelectric plants operated by entities like Alabama Power or Power South. These facilities depend on consistent flows for energy generation. In addition, the river provides drinking water, industrial use, and recreational opportunities in places like Columbus, Georgia, Lake Eufaula, and the Coosa-Tallapoosa system. So Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama are two sides of the river in a very popular area where individuals rely on the river and the community that's built around the river for recreation. We also have the Coosa-Tallapoosa system, which is often linked to the ACF in broader water management discussions. Alabama has repeatedly argued that Georgia's upstream withdrawals reduce the ability to safely and sustainably operate these systems, especially in times of drought. The state has joined or led numerous lawsuits demanding more equitable sharing of this resource. And then we have Florida. So further south, the Apalachicola River supports one of the most ecologically important and economically valuable estuaries in the United States, the Apalachicola Bay. This bay once produced 90% of Florida's oysters and 10% of the U.S. total. But the delicate balance of freshwater and saltwater that sustains the bay's ecosystem has been severely disrupted. Reduced freshwater inflows from upstream have led to saltwater intrusion, increased predation, and disease in oysters, and eventually the collapse of the fishery. In 2020, the state of Florida halted all wild oyster harvesting in the bay, citing ecosystem degradation. It's now closed until at least this year, with uncertain prospects of its recovery. Beyond economics, Florida's concerns include wetland conservation, endangered species protection, and public health, as water scarcity increases pollutant concentration and harms aquatic life. As a researcher, I'm currently working on a project within the Chipola, which is connected to the Apalachicola Basin. So the Chipola River, specifically, we are looking at endangered mussels and their historical habitats and what those populations still are to this day. So in summary, these downstream regions, especially those in Florida, see themselves as bearing the brunt of Atlanta's growth. They argue that upstream water use in Georgia ignores the environmental, economic, and cultural value of healthy flows downstream. So all of this leads us to one of the key physical and political focal points in the ACF water wars, Lake Lanier, and the dam that created it, the Buford Dam. So now we'll zoom into the centerpiece of this ACF conflict, the infrastructure that both supplies Atlanta's water and regulates flow throughout the basin, Lake Lanier and the Buford Dam that created it. This lake was formed in 1957 when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed the Buford Dam on the Chattahoochee River. At the time, this was one of the largest public works projects in the Southeast and a cornerstone of federal water policy in the post-World War II era. The dam had three original purposes: flood control, to protect downstream communities and property, hydropower generation, supplying electricity to the region, and navigation, helping to maintain boating routes or barge routes on the lower Apalachicola system. It was never meant to be a drinking water reservoir, and this is where things start to get interesting. So if you notice what is missing from that list, we've got flood control, hydropower, navigation. We're missing, of its original authorized purposes, municipal water supply. This was not one of the original purposes of the dam or the lake. But before we move on and talk about the legal mandates related to those different uses, it's crucial for us to understand two major environmental laws that apply here, because they form the backbone of many of the legal arguments that we'll be following. First, we have NEPA, so that's the National Environmental Policy Act from 1970. This law requires federal agencies to assess environmental impacts before making major decisions. It mandates environmental impact statements and public disclosures of risks when projects affect ecosystems, water systems, or human health. Then we have the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This law requires that the federal government to protect species that are listed as endangered or threatened, as well as the critical habitats that they depend on. If a project, like a dam or a water withdrawal plan, threatens those species, it must be evaluated, mitigated, or even halted. Both NEPA and ESA are invoked constantly in water disputes, and in the case of the ACF, they become central to whether Lake Lanier's reallocation is even legal. So now that we understand what Lake Lanier originally was designed to do and what laws govern its use, let's talk about what happened when Atlanta's population exploded and the city started using more and more water from the lake. This is where the legal battles begin. So by the late 1980s, Metro Atlanta's population was surging, and so was its demand for water. Atlanta began relying heavily on Lake Lanier as a primary water supply, even though this was not an authorized use under the lake's original charter. The city's water utilities, supported by the state of Georgia, began pushing for a formal legal path to reallocate some of the lake's storage specifically for that municipal water supply. So in 1989, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers proposed a water reallocation plan that would dedicate a portion of Lake Lanier's capacity to meet Atlanta's needs, effectively modifying the lake's original purpose. That decision sparked a wave of lawsuits from the neighboring states. Alabama immediately sued the Corps in 1990, arguing that reallocation would significantly reduce flows into Alabama, threatening hydropower generation, water quality, and ecological systems. And Florida then joined the suit, citing the risk of harm to the Apalachicola Bay estuary, which depends on those freshwater inflows to maintain its delicate salinity balance and support commercial oyster harvesting. So Georgia, on the other hand, so now we have Alabama and Florida suing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now we also have Georgia, who was suing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but from the opposite direction. It argued that the Corps should allow even more water to be withdrawn from Lake Lanier to support the growing metro needs. So by 1990, we had all three states, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, plus the federal government, in active litigation over the same resource. This marked the official start of what the media dubbed the tri-state water wars. Faced with the potential for a massive and costly legal battle, the state and the Corps agreed to a temporary legal stay. Basically, that means they were hitting a pause button on the lawsuits so that they could explore a collaborative solution. That effort would become the 1997 ACF Compact, which we'll look at next. So after years of escalating litigation and mounting public pressure, the three states and the U.S. Army Corps decided to pursue a collaborative approach. In 1997, they created the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin Compact, which is more commonly known as the ACF Compact. This compact was ratified by Congress and passed by the legislators of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. The goal was ambitious, to establish a formal framework for sharing water across the entire ACF basin. But what's important to understand is that the compact didn't establish concrete rules. It was essentially a process of agreement, which is a legal commitment to share data, collaborate on hydrological modeling, evaluate ecological needs, and eventually produce an equitable water allocation formula. So basically they said, we're going to do more research together. Think of this as an agreement to agree, a promise to work together in good faith towards a solution. For a while, things looked pretty hopeful. Teams of scientists, lawyers, engineers, and policymakers from all three states worked on comprehensive water models. They studied inflows, withdrawals, population growth, climate variability, endangered species, and economic needs. But it did not take long for negotiations to hit a wall here. As each state ran the models, it became clear that every proposed solution benefited one state at the expense of another. Georgia often proposed scenarios where it retained more water upstream. Florida and Alabama countered with plans that prioritized flow protection downstream. The political climate grew increasingly tense, and after 6 years, the parties failed to reach consensus, and the compact expired in 2003 with no water sharing agreement in place. When the compact collapsed, so did the temporary litigation pause. All previous lawsuits were reactivated, and the water wars were back in court. So let's take a look at what happened next when the legal battle resumed full force in the early 2000s, and how the focus shifted from negotiations to lawsuits under NEPA and the Endangered Species Act. So after the ACF compact expired in 2003, the gloves have come off at that point. The litigation resumed with full intensity. The legal landscape quickly became complex with multiple lawsuits and overlapping claims, but the central issues remained the same. Alabama and Florida's position, they alleged that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had violated NEPA and the ESA by reallocating Lake Lanier's water without conducting proper environmental studies or consulting with the affected states. They argued that Georgia's growing withdrawals were causing irreversible harm to their water supplies, industries, and ecosystems, especially Florida's oyster fisheries and Alabama's hydropower and recreation economy. Georgia's position, where Georgia sued the Corps as well, but for the opposite reason. Georgia's position was where they sued the Corps as well, but for the opposite reason. The state argued that the Corps had refused to authorize enough water for Atlanta's needs. Georgia claimed that providing water to its capital was not only justified but essential, and that the Corps had misinterpreted its own authority. The courtroom arguments revolved around two main legal questions. Did the Corps have the authority to reallocate water storage to Lake Lanier to serve Atlanta? And was the Corps complying with environmental laws, including its duty to protect endangered species and assess downstream impacts? These lawsuits would make their way through federal district courts, appeals courts, and eventually all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, not once, but multiple times over the next 2 decades. And as the legal battles intensified, another key player entered the fray, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is charged with protecting threatened and endangered species impacted by flow decisions. Their role would dramatically raise the stakes of the litigation because it shifted the conversation from just human water needs to biodiversity, ecosystems, and legal obligations under the Endangered Species Act. So let's now explore how and why the Fish and Wildlife Service became one of the most influential agencies in the entire water war, and what was at risk for the species living downstream. When we talk about water rights, we tend to focus on people, cities, farmers, power companies, but what about non-human stakeholders? Enter the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is the federal agency that's tasked with implementing the Endangered Species Act. This is one of the most powerful environmental laws in the United States. Under the ESA, any federal project, like water management by the Army Corps, must not jeopardize endangered or threatened species or degrade their critical habitats. And downstream from Lake Lanier, the Apalachicola River system is home to several federally protected species, including the Gulf sturgeon and freshwater mussels. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that reduced flows caused by upstream withdrawals could critically endanger these species, not just biologically, but legally as well. This meant that lake releases couldn't be based on human needs alone. The Corps had to ensure minimum flows downstream. Any action that failed to protect these species could trigger legal injunctions, fines, or even halt future water projects. And for many in Atlanta, this created intense frustration. They felt that mussels were being prioritized over millions of people. But for environmentalists and legal experts, This was a crucial victory, a rare instance where federal law forced governments to respect ecosystem needs. These species became a legal and ethical litmus test for how seriously the U.S. takes biodiversity in times of resource scarcity. In the Apalachicola River system, 4 species are especially affected by flow changes, starting with the Gulf sturgeon. This is a large, ancient-looking, bottom-dwelling fish. It kind of is like a living dinosaur. It can grow to over 8 feet long and weigh several hundred pounds. This species is anadromous, which means it migrates from saltwater to freshwater to spawn, similar to how salmon migrate. The sturgeon spawning success depends on a variety of factors, such as strong spring flows to cue that upstream migration, access to deep, cool, oxygenated pools, clean gravel substrates for laying eggs, and when river flows are reduced, spawning runs can be delayed or disrupted. Juveniles could become stranded or subjected to lethal temperatures. As those flows get reduced, those pools get warmer. Water can also become hypoxic or become low in oxygen, which can stress adults. And because sturgeon take 10 plus years to mature and reproduce, only every few years, any prolonged disturbances to their breeding cycle can collapse entire generations. Gulf sturgeon are long-lived. Their recovery is also very slow and vulnerable to cumulative impacts. We also have freshwater mussels such as the fat Threeridge, Chipola slabshell, and the purple bank climber. The ACF is a hotspot for freshwater mussel diversity, but these species are also among the most endangered in the country. Freshwater mussels, unionid mussels, are considered one of the most imperiled taxa in North America. These are also some of the most sensitive species to changes in flow. So let's focus starting with just the fat Threeridge, for example. This is a federally endangered mussel that's endemic to the Apalachicola River. Its biology reveals why consistent flow is very critical. Mussels have unique life cycles. They have a parasitic larval stage called Glaucidia, and these tiny larvae must attach to the gills or fins of a specific host species, which is generally a fish, and they have to do that to survive and develop. So after they hitch a ride on a fish for a few days or a few weeks, they'll drop off and settle into the riverbed as they metamorphose into juveniles after dropping off. So without proper flow, all of this can get disrupted because host fish movements can get disrupted, which would reduce the mussel's chances of having the host fish come to them and successful attachment on the host fish that's nearby. Glaucidia could also be released into unsuitable or stagnant waters where they would die because they cannot reach the fish then. And adults also may become exposed during low flows, or they could get in sediment-choked waters with low oxygen conditions, which could stress them and affect their reproductive cycles. So why does all this matter? Flow alterations reduce these host fish mobility, they'll fragment these mussel populations, and they limit the genetic exchange between isolated mussel beds. So over time, this would result in low reproductive success. This results in genetic bottlenecks, which genetic diversity is important for the persistence of species. That's how they adapt. And it also increases the risk of local extinction. So remember, mussels also filter feed, and that helps clean and stabilize river ecosystems. Losing mussels can lead to broader water quality declines. So when we talk about protecting endangered mussels, we're not just protecting obscure animals that look like rocks. We're protecting biological infrastructure of the river system itself and things that the ecosystem depends on. So why does the Fish and Wildlife Service matter in all of this and in water management? Because of these vulnerabilities, the Fish and Wildlife Service plays a central role in the ACF water decisions. They've set minimum flow requirements for downstream survival, advised against excessive withdrawals during droughts, and partnered with the Corps to develop biological opinions that influence dam operations. Their involvement may frustrate some water users, especially in Georgia, who argue that mussels and sturgeon are being prioritized over human needs. But from a legal and an ethical standpoint, the Endangered Species Act demands that all federally protected species be considered, even when it's inconvenient or politically unpopular. These species, quiet, slow-moving, and often invisible, have become symbols of the broader question, are we willing to adjust human systems to preserve natural ones? And speaking of human systems, let's discuss some human failures. There was a critical error by the Army Corps of Engineers during the 2000s droughts that would push the entire situation into a crisis, bringing national media attention and emergency level political tension. So let's look at what happened with that. In late 2005, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers installed a new lake level gauge at Lake Lanier. Unfortunately, there was a mistake that was made here. The gauge was not calibrated correctly, and as a result, it overestimated the water level by about 2 feet. In practical terms, this meant that the Corps believed that the lake had more water than it actually did. So what happened? Between 2005 and mid-2006, the Corps released approximately 22 billion gallons of extra water from Lake Lanier, thinking that they were operating under normal conditions and maintaining the lake level that they were supposed to. But when the error was discovered in summer of 2006, it coincided with one of the worst droughts in recent Georgia history. So by 2007, Lake Lanier had fallen to 20 feet below full pool, or the level that it should have been at. News outlets began reporting that Atlanta could run out of water within months, because remember, they're maintaining this water level in Lake Lanier not only for downstream flow, but this is also municipal water supply for Atlanta now. Because of this, political leaders declared emergencies, water restrictions were enacted, and unfortunately, public trust in the Army Corps' management of this plummeted. But yet, even during this drought crisis, the minimum flow requirement for endangered species remained in place under the Endangered Species Act. That meant that the Corps still had to release 5,000 cubic feet per second downstream. If you want to visualize what a cubic foot per second looks like, 1 cubic foot per second flowing through something is equivalent to like 1 basketball. So that's saying that the water releases that had to come to be flowing downstream, it's about 5,000 basketballs have to flow at any time. So that kind of gives you a volume of water that has to go. And that's to maintain the minimum flow standards for those things that live downstream, so we're not getting too low of flows downstream. Because remember, it's starting at Lake Lanier, but water also gets pulled out and used for other sources. If we look at this example of dams that are on the ACF, through this system, it starts where we're talking about Buford Dam up here at the top of the Chattahoochee, but you have other dams and reservoirs in place as well. So you have Buford, Morgan Falls, West Point, here you have the Chattahoochee, and this is bringing you into Columbus, George, Andrews, and Woodruff. Now you're getting into the Apalachicola, you have the Flint River feed into here. So Lake Lanier has to release water so that we're maintaining minimum flows downstream, but we're also having flows pulled out, or we can have water withdrawals at other points downstream. We have other reservoirs as well. So this is like a cascading series of management events that could influence the water that ends up downstream. But with all of this, and there's a critical emergency concern right now of not having enough water in Lake Lanier for Atlanta, they still have to release water to comply with Endangered Species Act. So they're releasing 5,000 cubic feet per second downstream, even though there were record lows up in Atlanta. So here we ended up with an almost impossible ethical dilemma. We had to uphold federal environmental law and protect biodiversity with these minimum flow standards, or cut flows to keep Atlanta's taps running. So ultimately, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps agreed to a temporary measure, reducing flows downstream to increase storage upstream, which was kind of an emergency resource triage strategy. This did come at a cost though. Downstream ecosystems suffered. Salinity in the Apalachicola Bay increased because of not enough freshwater input to balance that, and we saw acceleration of species declines. The gauge error and the drought really sharpened the stakes here, bringing public awareness, media attention, and political pressure to new heights. And from this point forward, the ACF conflict wasn't just a legal matter. It became a defining environmental justice issue for the Southeast. In the next section, we're going to walk through how the conflict evolved through the 2010s and the 2020s, and why, even after decades of litigation and negotiation, there's still no permanent agreement in place. So as we move into the 2010s and the 2020s in this timeline, the ACF water wars continue to evolve, but still without resolution. So let's walk through some of the key moments that define the modern phase of this decades-long dispute. In 2009, there was a federal court ruling that municipal water supply is not an authorized use of Lake Lanier. This seemed to affirm Florida and Alabama's arguments that they had been making until this brings us to the 2010-2012 era. The tide shifted. A federal judge ruled that the Army Corps didn't violate the Endangered Species Act, and another court overturned the water supply ruling, stating that Atlanta can legally draw water from Lake Lanier. The U.S. Supreme Court did uphold that in 2012, which was a major win for Georgia. So this brings us to 2014, where Florida launched a new lawsuit, this time invoking equitable apportionment. This was a doctrine under which states must receive a fair share of shared water resources. Florida argues that Georgia is using too much and harming downstream ecosystems. So from 2017 to 2018, a special master appointed by the Supreme Court recommended denying Florida's request, but the court said it needed more evidence before deciding. Legal limbo continued. Bringing us to 2019-2021, the legal case fizzles, with Florida's lawsuit ultimately dismissed and the Army Corps finalizing a new water manual that largely favored Atlanta. The Supreme Court sides with Georgia in 2021. Meanwhile, the real-world impacts on ecosystems have become dire. Oyster harvests in Apalachicola Bay collapsed due to insufficient freshwater flows and saltwater intrusion. In 2020, Florida did impose a harvesting moratorium through 2025 to allow for habitat recovery. And we also had Hurricane Michael in 2018, which further devastated habitats and infrastructure. We had species die-offs, wetland shrinkage, and hypoxic water conditions becoming more frequent, and looming over it all, climate change. More intense droughts, irregular rainfall, hotter summers, more frequent storms. These are all projected to amplify, and it's going to amplify all of these challenges we've been discussing as urban demand continues to grow. Despite multiple lawsuits, expert panels, and public outcry, as of now, there is still no binding tri-state water sharing agreement among the states. The ecosystems remain flow-starved, and restoration is underway but not certain. So with all of this history in mind, we're left with a series of powerful ethical questions. So let's reflect on what this case really tells us about resource use, justice, and ecological responsibility. So this slide here, this is about you. It's about all of us grappling with the big picture ethical dilemmas raised by the ACF water wars. Let's walk through each of these considerations together. How do you balance human water consumption and biodiversity? Is it ethical to prioritize the needs of a growing city over endangered species? Do we have a moral duty to protect ecosystems even if it limits human convenience? Or should species adapt or perish in a human-dominated landscape? It's giving Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Should any stakeholder have more say than another? Does Atlanta, with 5+ million people and regional economic power, does Atlanta deserve more water than a rural fishery in Florida or a farmer in Alabama? Should population size be the main factor, or political influence? What about historical use or ecological dependency? What voice should the public have? Should everyday users, recreational paddlers, oyster harvesters, lakeside homeowners, should they have a say in these decisions? Or should policy be left entirely to engineers, to lawyers, to government agencies? Who owns the water? Does water belong to whoever has physical access to it? Does the state own it? The federal government? Is it a shared public trust? And if it's flowing across borders, who decides how much gets to leave? How is this applied to other resources? Can we draw lessons from the ACF for managing other commons? Think about the atmosphere, like greenhouse gases, the oceans, fisheries, plastic pollution, groundwater aquifers. and even global climate stability. Ultimately, this case isn't just about water. It's about how we ethically govern shared finite resources in an unequal and interconnected world. So to help solve problems like this, one 19th century geologist did have a radical idea. So let's take a quick detour to look at alternative ways to draw boundaries, one based not on politics, but on hydrology. So in the 19th century, American geologist and explorer John Wesley Powell, yes, the guy the Colorado River's Powell Reservoir is named after, he proposed a revolutionary idea. He suggested that as we form new states in the western U.S., they should be delineated along watershed boundaries, not arbitrary lines of latitude and longitude. So his reasoning was deeply practical. Watersheds are natural units of resource management. They define shared hydrology, ecological systems, and community interdependence. I said earlier, watersheds do not respect state boundaries, but what if our state boundaries were those watersheds? Managing water, soil, forests, and agriculture would be more efficient and less contentious within a single hydrological unit. And in other words, if everyone in a state was part of the same watershed, you wouldn't have the interstate fights over water because everyone would be working from the same resource base. Unfortunately, Powell's idea was rejected, largely due to pressure from the railroad industry and other land speculators. But they preferred the checkerboard method at the time, the one that we ended up with, which, as we've seen, creates major problems when rivers cross political borders. But today, Powell's vision is seeing a resurgence. While redrawing straight lines is probably unrealistic, many regions are forming interstate river basin commissions, watershed councils, and collaborative management boards, inspired by Powell's principle that hydrology, not politics, should guide resource planning. So as we close today, let's bring this back to you. How will you take what you've learned about ecosystems, ethics, and environmental law into your own reflections and work? So as we wrap up, here are your key tasks for the week and a preview of what's coming up as we finish our term. You'll have a discussion post reflecting on water wars, tragedy of the commons, shared resources. So I'm going to make this due a little bit later since your lecture was posted a little later this week. And then you will have several days to do your replies. Your reflection assignment is for you to watch Water Wars and then create your reflection based on that. And looking ahead to next week, we're going to round off our topic with food systems, and potentially, if I'm able, I'm going to get another lecture uploaded on the history of conservation ethics, but we'll definitely round off with food systems. I'm not going to have you do a reflection, but you will be watching a movie just for your own knowledge on that. Instead of the reflection and assignments for next week with food systems, during the week I'm going to have you do your final exam, which is our exam 2, as that is the last week of the semester. So as always, you can feel free to message me. I'll reply within 24 to 48 hours, and I'm always happy to talk through any confusion or feedback you may have. Thank you so much for your engagement today and throughout the term so far. This is a complex topic, but it's one of the most meaningful and consequential ones that we cover in this course, as it's ongoing, and these problems will only continue to be exacerbated as we grow. You're now equipped with one of the most powerful case studies in environmental ethics, so I cannot wait to see what you all do with it. Have a wonderful week, and we will see each other again soon.